Most likely, leaders of the American Indian movement ordered her execution because they thought that she might be an FBI informant. And this devastating misjudgment led to her abduction, interrogation, and ultimately her murder. Welcome back to Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation podcast, where we discuss history, sociology, Native issues, and everything in between. I'm Dr. B, and in today's episode, we're going to discuss the death of Anna Mae and the American Indian movement. This is an incredible story. I'll be unpacking the chilling 4-part documentary titled Vow of Silence, the Assassination of Annie Mae. And if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it. It's gripping, informative, and it sheds light on a tragic story that has been overshadowed for decades. Let me begin by saying the story of the American Indian movement is really close to my heart. When I was just a teenager, a close friend of mine gave me this book titled In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. It's written by Peter Mathiasson. And at that time, I was a terrible student. I was uninterested in academics, had no interest in becoming an academic. I didn't know anything about college, had no interest in college at that time. But when I started reading this book, I could not put it down. And I ended up reading it in a couple of days. And the book is like 400, 500 pages long. And I always tell people the story of the American Indian movement changed my life. I went to the public school system, never learned much about Indigenous history, my own history. And when I picked up that book, it just was so enlightening and it was so powerful. And it gave me a completely different narrative of American history. And I always tell people that it's this book, I feel, that set me on a different path in life. And then, of course, the story of Leonard Peltier and what happened to him being convicted of aiding and abetting the murder of 2 FBI agents. And that story is one that I want to unpack here as well, because there is a connection with Leonard and his involvement with Annie Mae's death. And so the story is important to me, and I always knew about Annie Mae, what had happened to her, that she was killed, but there were more details to the story that, of course, we don't find out until decades later. And I want to jump into that today. Let's start with Annie Mae. She was a Mi'kmaq activist and educator. She was deeply involved in the American Indian movement, better known as AIM. She was a fierce advocate for Indigenous rights going all the way back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. And she was fighting against the oppression of Native Americans, not just here in the United States, but also in Canada as well. And tragically, Annie Mae was murdered in 1975. Her body was discovered on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 1976. But there's so much more to her story. And one of the things I really liked about this 4-part documentary is that the director really does dive deep into her personal life and how she was raised. She was raised up on her own land. She was raised traditionally. She spoke her own language. And like all Native families, she experienced a lot of trauma. Her mother had left the children when she was a young age. And she was just a survivor. And you could really see that in the documentary. And also shared a lot about her sisters, her family members, who really fought hard to make sure that her story wasn't forgotten. She eventually moves to Boston and she marries a Mi'kmaq man. They have 2 children, 2 beautiful children who are still alive today, also very pivotal in ensuring that their mother's story is never forgotten. And from there, she ends up joining the American Indian movement. And of course, it sends her on a completely different path in life. Let's talk about the death of Annie Mae. She was shot in back of the head in 1975, and her body wouldn't be found until 1976. And we know today that most likely leaders of the American Indian movement ordered her execution because they thought that she might be an FBI informant. And this devastating misjudgment led to her abduction, interrogation, and ultimately her murder. Now, when they found Anna Mae's body in 1975, they didn't know it was her. They actually buried her as a Jane Doe, and they said that she died of exposure. They also cut off her hands as well, and they sent them to an FBI office where she was later identified. And when she was identified, her family wanted another autopsy done. So they were able to exhume her body, do another autopsy, and they found a bullet in the back of her head. And so now we know that Anna Mae was shot and killed, but we don't know just yet who shot and killed her. And when I read the book, In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, there was a lot of discussions of Anna Mae throughout the book, but never once did Peter Mathiasen ever accuse the American Indian movement of having any kind of involvement in her death. In fact, the narrative that was coming from the American Indian movement was that it was the FBI who had her killed. And now we know that it was the American Indian movement. People within the movement killed Annie Mae. And the documentary does such a good job of highlighting how AIM was at one time a beacon of hope for Indigenous communities and how it was inspiring people all around Turtle Island, but also how they became entangled in paranoia, infiltrations, infighting, some of which ultimately contributed to Annie Mae's death. And it's devastating to see how this movement, born out of love and resistance, became fractured under the pressures of surveillance and manipulation. And I think for me, learning about this was just devastating. Don't get me wrong, I never thought the American Indian movement was perfect and their leadership was perfect and that they never made mistakes. But it was still devastating to learn that they, in fact, killed one of their own. And there are some things that contributed to that I believe that the government is responsible for, that the FBI is responsible for. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. But to learn that the American Indian movement, people that I certainly respected, played a role in the demise of somebody as important and significant as Anna Mae. And she wasn't just a regular person. She was a leader. She was very vocal. She didn't take any crap from anybody, and she was always on the front lines. Obviously incredibly intelligent, and she gave so much to this movement, and she sacrificed so much for her people, for all Indigenous communities, and to see what was done to her and to know that it was ultimately her own people, the people that she had sided with who did her in, is just incredibly sad. The American Indian movement is accusing the FBI for having involvement in her murder. And then there's rumors that are being floated around that she was killed by members of the American Indian movement. But eventually people started to come forward and tell the story of what happened to Anna Mae. And two men eventually were held accountable for their roles in her death. First, there's John Graham. Graham was extradited from British Columbia in 2007, and he was convicted of felony murder in 2010 for his role in Annie Mae's death. His conviction was a significant moment in a long pursuit of justice for Annie Mae. But it also opens up old wounds, and it raises a lot of questions of how AIM's internal conflicts were manipulated by external forces like the FBI. And there are some people who argue, and there is evidence, that the FBI, in fact, knew about Annie Mae's death before her body was even found. And they knew that the person that was discovered on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 1976 was Annie Mae. Yet, she was buried as a Jane Doe. So there were probably informants working for the FBI that the FBI did not want to expose, people who were giving information to the FBI stating what happened to Annie Mae. Then there's Arlo Looking Cloud. He's a former American Indian Movement member. He's not a high-ranking member. He's not a part of leadership. He's more of an enforcer. And Looking Cloud does confess to participating in Annie Mae's abduction and murder. And in 2003, he's sentenced to life in prison, but his sentence was reduced to 20 years after he turned state's evidence and he testifies against Graham. Now, I will say this, John Graham does proclaim to be innocent. He says that he had no involvement in the murder of Annie Mae. But these convictions brought some clarity to the events leading up to Annie Mae's murder. But like I said, they also highlight these fractures within AIM and the devastating impact of FBI's COINTELPRO program. And if you don't know anything about COINTELPRO, and I didn't know anything about the FBI, anything about these counterintelligence programs until I read the book In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. And that was my first introduction. And since then, I've done a lot of research on the COINTELPRO program and just how devastating they were to these movements in the 1960s and 1970s, whether it was the Red Power movement, the Black Power movement, civil rights. The FBI created COINTELPRO basically to destroy these social movements. So you can't discuss this case without addressing the role of the FBI in the creation of COINTELPRO. It was designed to dismantle organizations like AIM, the Black Panther movement, any civil rights movement, anything that was a threat to the status quo. COINTELPRO aimed to destroy. So through surveillance, infiltration, manipulation, COINTELPRO sowed distrust and chaos within AIM, creating a climate of fear that directly contributed to Annie Mae's murder. This is what I believe had happened. And in Annie Mae's own words in the documentary, she gave one interview and she talked about how the FBI was threatening her. And you can kind of see through the FBI's actions that they were looking to bad jacket her, which is basically try to present her in a bad light to her own people. That was a common tactic by the FBI during COINTELPRO, probably still today. I'm sure they still use these tactics even right now. But any type of social movement that's a threat, you send people in to destabilize the movement. And one way to destabilize it is to get them to turn against each other, to divide the individuals who are leading the movement. And I think there's that element as well. And there were some things too that the documentary talks about that I think led to maybe some people not liking Annie Mae. She did have an affair with Dennis Banks, who was married at that time, and she was friends with Dennis Banks' wife. It's an interesting twist to the story, and there were some people who didn't like her, apparently, within the movement. A lot of people loved Annie Mae because she was so powerful, she was so intelligent, and she was a hard worker. And she jumped right in and tried her best to be not just a member of AIM, but a member of AIM who was really, really active in trying to bring about positive change for Indigenous communities. And there may have been people who were just jealous of her, didn't like her. And it's very common for people who are leaders to, unfortunately, get some hate from people. But I'm sure sleeping with Dennis Banks didn't help the situation. And apparently there were people in the movement who just simply didn't like her. All right, let me get back to the FBI because there was an interview in one of the episodes on the documentary that caught my attention. They spoke with the FBI agent. He talked about how, oh, we're not political and we just arrest people who are committing crimes. But we know that the FBI weren't simply monitoring the American Indian movement. They were actively working to neutralize and destroy the movement from within. So the trail of broken treaties, the occupation of Wounded Knee, all these direct actions that AIM was taking really did put a bullseye on them. And it did intensify the federal government's effort to destroy the movement from within. And we know by the COINTELPRO papers that were eventually exposed that the FBI was involved in all kinds of dirty business. And that is something that Peter Mathiasen in his book, In a Spirit of Crazy Horse, does a really good job of fleshing out. And I think that's something that really changed me. I looked at the government differently. And I think growing up, when I was a kid, there's no social media. I grew up with just a couple TV channels, no cable TV, no internet. And I just always felt there was something wrong. And I could always see that you had people who had a lot and you had people who had very little. And the people who had very little was always people with darker skin. And I just intuitively knew that just something wasn't right in this country. But reading what the FBI was doing to these social movements, not just the American Indian movement, but the Black Panther Party, Dr. King's movement. I mean, there was a concerted effort by our federal government, the FBI, to destroy these civil rights movements. And I do believe that the FBI played a very significant role in the death, not just of Annie Mae, but several other Native Americans who are killed in the 1970s. Okay, let's talk about Leonard Peltier, another key figure in the story of Annie Mae. Leonard's name is synonymous with the American Indian movement and Indigenous resistance. He's currently serving 2 life sentences for aiding and abetting the murder of 2 FBI agents in 1975 on the Jumping Bull Ranch. There was a shootout and 2 FBI agents were killed. One Native American was also killed, Joe Stuntz. And Leonard was able to flee along with others. He eventually makes it to Canada. 2 other individuals, Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler, were apprehended and they were put on trial for the murder of these 2 FBI agents while Leonard was waiting extradition in Canada. Incredibly, Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler are acquitted of murdering these 2 FBI agents, and they had used the defense of self-defense. And if Leonard was extradited sooner back to the United States, he probably would have been put on trial with Dino Butler and Bob Robidoux, and he probably would have been acquitted. But he wasn't extradited until later, after the Myrtle Poor Bear affidavit, which is another interesting story in and of itself. And I think it explains even further just how many dirty tactics the FBI was using to destroy AIM. And they tortured this poor Native American woman, and she ended up writing an affidavit that was false, stating that she was Leonard's girlfriend and that he had said that he had killed the 2 FBI agents. And Leonard didn't even know who Myrtle Poor Bear was. Myrtle Poor Bear had never met Leonard, but the FBI had targeted Myrtle Poor Bear, and they were able to coerce her into writing this bogus affidavit, which eventually led to his extradition. He was tried, and he was convicted of killing these 2 FBI agents. As it stands today, Leonard's been in prison for some 50 years. And when I read the book In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, It chronicles the whole story of AIM, but it really does focus in on Leonard Peltier. And that story in and of itself is just absolutely incredible. But the documentary does provide me with some information that I did not know about regarding the relationship between Annie Mae and Leonard. Now, I know there are a lot of people who do not want to see Leonard Peltier be released from prison. I've always advocated for his release, and I still do. And I'm hoping that this man, who is now 80 years old, will be able to come home to his family before he crosses over. And the reason why a lot of people don't want to see him released is because of Annie Mae and his involvement with what happened to her. Now, let me just say, there is no credible evidence that I have seen connecting Peltier to Annie Mae's murder. But his name does appear in the documentary, and he was with Annie Mae while he was on the run. Annie Mae was on the run as well. They were both evading the authorities. And we also know that Leonard Peltier did interrogate Annie Mae when she was being accused of being an informant. And there were a lot of informants who were infiltrating the American Indian movement. These were part of the dirty tactics by the FBI. So Leonard does interrogate Annie Mae. And some say that he put something up against her head. And I'm sure that was very upsetting to people in her community when they learned that he played a role in threatening her. Now, Leonard says that he did not threaten her, that he had a conversation with her. That was part of his job, is vetting people. And again, there was just a lot of paranoia in the movement. And because of the dirty tactics by COINTELPRO, the FBI, I think there was just a lot of people who were pointing fingers at one another. Unfortunately, people were pointing fingers at Annie Mae. Now, for those of you who want to dive deeper into Leonard Peltier's possible role in the murder of Annie Mae, I would encourage you to check out the Red Nation podcast. Nick Estes, who's a historian, does a really good job of explaining Leonard's role in that situation. And again, I'm not saying that Leonard was a perfect person. I'm not defending anybody within the American Indian movement. These were human beings. Human beings make mistakes. And there was all kinds of womanizing going on in the American Indian movement. The documentary touches on that. And trust me, the documentary does not paint the American Indian movement in a positive light all the time. Initially it does, but it also shows that, like all social movements, it has its faults. Like all leaders, they have their faults. And every single leader within the movement, whether it's Dennis Banks, Russell Means, Leonard Peltier, Clyde Bellecourt, all these men had their faults. And it was very much a patriarchal movement. There was a lot of women behind the scenes, a lot of outspoken women like Annie Mae that unfortunately did not get a lot of attention, that were a big part of structuring the American Indian movement, but it was always the men who were out front. And these men often behaved badly. But what's heartbreaking to me is that Leonard remains behind bars despite significant questions about the fairness of his trial. And I even believe, even if he did murder these FBI agents, it's been nearly 50 years. And why can't we just show some compassion for him? But I don't believe he was involved in her murder. And again, I encourage you, if you want to learn more about this, do your own research. But I would check out the Red Nation podcast. That's an excellent podcast, by the way. Absolutely outstanding. But the episode that Nick Estes does on Leonard was really enlightening and did shed a lot of light on this case that I was unfamiliar with. So I encourage you to check that out. The documentary also touches on the broader struggles that AIM faced, including the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972 and the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. These events were monumental in drawing attention to Native issues, but they also intensified the federal government's crackdown on AIM. The Trail of Broken Treaties brought activists to Washington, D.C., demanding justice and the honoring of treaties. It ended in the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that story is really interesting in of itself. And Annie Mae was there along with her two children. Her two children talk about their experiences at this takeover of the BIA headquarters. Then eventually there's Wounded Knee, which was a 71-day standoff between AIM activists and federal forces, making this one of the most significant acts of resistance in Indigenous history. Annie Mae also participates in the 71-day standoff at Wounded Knee. She arrives with weapons to help in the defense of Wounded Knee, and she actually gets remarried during the standoff. And for 2 months, the federal government, with all its might, they bring in tanks. They have people with AR-15s, all the best weapons, having fighter jets fly over Wounded Knee. It's an incredible, incredible story in and of itself. And sadly, there is a Native American, I think 2 Native Americans who are killed at Wounded Knee. Countless people are injured. And eventually, after 71 days, the people who took over Wounded Knee agreed to end the standoff. And at this point in time, the federal government changes its strategy, and they decide to start arresting members of the movement and charging them with crime after crime to get them caught up in court cases. And of course, court cases drain your financial resources, and it's not like these individuals have a lot of money. Although they do get a lot of donations, especially from people in Hollywood, there are a lot of people who sympathize with members of the American Indian movement and the civil rights movement as a whole. And so they are getting some financial support, but they end up in the court system. And something I forgot to mention too about the Trail of Broken Treaties, when the occupation of the BIA headquarters had ended, members of the American Indian movement had taken away literally boxes and boxes of documents about treaty agreements and about the United States government's efforts to acquire illegally resources belonging to tribal nations. And if you know anything about the nation-to-nation relationship and treaties are the law of the land. And every single treaty was broken. And we know the federal government made a concerted effort not just to destroy tribal sovereignty, but to acquire not just all the land, but the resources on the land. And Native people still occupied a considerable amount of natural resources that the United States government wanted to acquire, wanted to exploit, natural resources that were essential to the economy. And so the Trail of Broken Treaties, the takeover of Wounded Knee, and all these direct actions, it's not just about getting out there and looking like a tough guy walking around with a weapon. Members of AIM were looking into these treaty violations. And when they occupied the BIA headquarters, they had put together a 20-point document stating all the things that they wanted. And one of these times I'll do an episode just on that. We can kind of flesh that out. And so I think that a lot of people got caught up in the direct action that AIM took. Let's face it, these guys were willing to fight. The women were willing to fight. They had a by any means necessary type of mindset. And this was not a peaceful movement. They were willing to take direct action. They carried firearms, and they were willing to defend themselves. And if you look at the origins of AIM, the whole point was to protect people in the inner cities, people who were a part of the relocation program, who had been sent from the reservations to the inner cities. This is the story of my family. This is how my family ended up in the Bay Area, is through the Relocation Act. And during this time, there's a lot of police brutality. There's Native Americans who are turning up dead all over the country. And AIM, their initial responsibility was to put together patrols so that way they could defend people who were being harassed by the police. And there were just so many different aspects of the American Indian movement that we don't really learn about because we focus so much on their direct action and the violence, but we don't look at the survival schools that they created. Annie Mae was a part of that as well. We don't look at some of these programs that they were looking to develop that were meant to protect Indigenous rights. And I think a lot of people didn't like AIM because they were considered to be troublemakers. And you can understand why, because they didn't take any crap off of anybody. And the documentary, I think, does a good job of explaining that. I wish it would have gone into more of the details surrounding what AIM was truly about. And I think that we kind of missed the point because we get caught up in these shootouts and these standoffs. And we forget that the AIM movement was really about protecting Indigenous treaty rights and addressing the oppression that had been taking place all over Indian country for the last 500 years. Vow of Silence isn't just a story about Annie Mae's murder. It's a story about the cost of resistance and the fractures within the American Indian movement and the relentless pursuit of justice on the part of Annie Mae's family, which is incredibly emotional. And watching it, I definitely felt a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. A determination to continue to learn and grow as a human being. Annie Mae's story deserves to be told, and I have so much respect for her daughters and her family who fought so hard to make sure that she would not be forgotten, and that the people who were responsible for her death would be held accountable. And sadly, there's people who were involved, at least I believe there is, people who were involved in her murder who've yet to be brought to justice, and maybe some of those people aren't even with us any longer. But her story is important. She was such an incredible person, so smart, so intelligent, and just a powerful human being. She was truly a warrior, not just for her Mi'kmaq people, but for all Indigenous communities, and her name should never be forgotten. Before I end this episode, I want to bring up one more point. Anna Mae's story is a powerful reminder of the ongoing epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW. Her case is emblematic of the violence Native women face, whether at the hands of individuals or systems of oppression. Annie Mae wasn't just an activist, she was also a teacher, a mother, and a woman who fought for her people. And throughout the decades of settler colonialism, thousands of Native women have gone missing or have been murdered, and their cases are far too often ignored by law enforcement, the media, or society as a whole. The MMIW movement seeks to shine light on these injustices to ensure that Native women are no longer treated as invisible. Anna Mae's murder wasn't just a personal tragedy. It's part of a broader pattern and system of violence against Indigenous women that continues to this day. And her story reminds us of the need to protect and uplift Indigenous women, to fight for justice, and to hold systems accountable for their failures. What's disturbing to me is that the FBI lied, wrote up false affidavits to extradite Leonard, to get him convicted of aiding and abetting the murder of 2 FBI agents. But yet Annie Mae, an Indigenous woman who is clearly executed, shot in back of the head, there is no justice for her. And if it wasn't for her family, if it wasn't for Indigenous women across Turtle Island, there would be no understanding of just how problematic the MMIW situation is, and this pattern of violence towards Indigenous peoples as a whole, but specifically towards Indigenous women. And this pattern of violence started in 1492, and it continues to this day. And Anna Mae's story is a reminder of that violence and the systemic issues that continue to go unaddressed. And this is part of a pattern of settler violence that all Indigenous communities live with each and every day. Thank you for tuning in to the 7th Generation Podcast and Dr. B Teaches. I encourage each and every one of you to continue to dive deeper into these stories, support Native-led movements, and always fight for justice whenever possible. Also, I'm really curious what you think of the content that I put out. So please comment in the comment section. If there's something that you want me to talk about, you could also let me know. You can reach out to me on my Instagram as well. You can follow me there. My handle is 7gen Podcast. Also, my podcast streams on all major platforms. You can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search the 7th Generation Podcast and you'll find me. You can also share my content if you like it. Feel free to share it with friends and family members that you think will like it as well. And like I said, all the support that I get from all of you, I'm humbled by it. For the people who've been following me for a while now, I really do appreciate it. And I encourage all of you to stay strong, to stay informed, and I'll see you all real soon. Till next time.